The council hall doors slammed open, and every head in the room turned at once. Elena froze in the doorway, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. 6 warriors stood behind her, their faces cold and unreadable, hurting her forward like she was already guilty of something she did not understand. At the far end of the hall sat Damon Cross, Alpha King of the Blackthorn Pack, his broad shoulders rigid, his jaw locked tight. He did not rise when she entered. He did not even look surprised. He looked instead like a man carved from stone, already sentencing her in his mind before a single word had been spoken. "Elena," he said, and his voice was not the voice she knew from quiet mornings and shared meals. It was the voice of the king, flat and final. "You stand accused of passing pack secrets to the Ashford clan. Secrets that led to the deaths of 12 of our warriors 3 nights ago." The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back a step, and one of the warriors caught her arm to keep her upright. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "Damon, that's not true. I would never. Do not call me that here." His eyes flashed gold for a moment, the color of his wolf rising close to the surface. "Not in this hall. Not after this." A council elder named Grace stepped forward, holding a folded piece of parchment between 2 fingers, as if it might burn her. "This note was found in the Ashford camp after the attack," she said. "It details our patrol routes, our weakest points along the eastern ridge, and the exact hour our warriors would be there. It is written in your hand, Elena." Elena's stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I never wrote that. I have never even been near the Ashford border." "The handwriting has been compared," Grace said. 3 separate scribes confirmed it matches yours." Elena searched the room, looking for any face that might soften, any pair of eyes that might believe her. She found none. Even the younger pack members who used to smile at her in the training yard now looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. A warrior named Oliver, who had once laughed with her over spilled soup in the mess hall, stared fixedly at the floor, as though the stone tiles held something urgent to study. She turned back to Damon, her mate, the man she had bonded with 2 years ago in front of the entire pack, the man who had promised to protect her with his life. "Please," she whispered, "look at me. You know me. You know I would never betray this pack. I would never betray you." For one heartbeat, something flickered behind his eyes, a hesitation, a crack in the stone. She saw it, and hope surged through her chest so fast it hurt. Then his jaw tightened again, and the crack sealed shut. 12 of our people are dead," he said quietly. And the quiet was worse than shouting. "Marcus Kane had a daughter who will grow up without a father because of what happened on that ridge. I buried my own cousin 2 days ago. Elena, do you understand that? I stood at his grave, and I promised him justice." "Then find the real traitor," she said, desperation rising in her throat. "Because it isn't me. The evidence says otherwise. Evidence can be forged. Handwriting can be copied. Someone is doing this to me, Damon. Please, you have to believe. I don't have to do anything." His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough for her to hear the pain buried beneath the fury. "I have to protect this pack. That is my duty. That has always been my duty, before anything else." An elder named Henry, seated near Grace, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since Elena had entered the hall. "My king, with respect, should we not allow her the chance to answer for herself more fully, before judgment is passed? A matter of this weight deserves careful examination." Damon's eyes cut toward him sharply. "You would have me wait, Henry, while the trail of whoever aided the Ashford clan grows colder by the hour? While the families of 12 dead warriors demand to know why their king hesitates to act?" Henry lowered his gaze respectfully, but did not fully retreat. "I only ask that we be certain, my king. A mistake made in haste cannot be easily undone." "I am certain," Damon said, though something in the rigid set of his shoulders suggested the words cost him more than he wished to show. "The evidence is clear. 3 scribes, a note in her own hand, a pattern of movement that places her near the eastern path in the days before the attack, movement she never once mentioned to me." Elena's breath caught. "I walked the eastern path because I was gathering herbs for Nathaniel's old recipes, the ones you asked me to prepare for the wounded after the last skirmish. I told you that. I told you weeks ago." "You told me you were gathering herbs," Damon said. "You did not tell me a stranger approached you there. You did not tell me anything was wrong." Elena's mind raced back through her own memory, searching for the moment he could possibly mean, and found nothing. No stranger had approached her on the eastern path, not that she could recall, not in any conversation she remembered having with him. Confusion joined the fear rising in her chest. "I don't understand," she said. "I never told you about any stranger, because there was no stranger. Daemon, what are you talking about?" Something shifted faintly in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty quickly buried beneath the mask of the king. He turned instead to Grace. "Read the rest of the note's contents into record," he said. "Let her hear precisely what has been laid against her." Grace unfolded the parchment fully and read aloud, her voice steady despite the tension thick in the hall. "The patrol along the eastern ridge changes guard at the second bell past midnight. The Northern Watch has grown careless in recent weeks, distracted by preparations for the harvest festival. Strike then, and the pack will not recover quickly from the loss." Elena listened, horror creeping through her limbs, as the details rang uncomfortably true. Details she herself might have known from living within the pack for 2 years. Details that could have been gathered by anyone paying close enough attention, and yet were framed here as though they had come directly and exclusively from her own private knowledge. "Anyone could have observed those things," she said, her voice rising now, panic threading through it. "Anyone who has lived here long enough, please, you must see that." "Anyone could have," Daemon agreed, his voice hollow. "But the handwriting is yours." "Then someone has learned to copy my hand, perfectly enough to fool 3 scribes," Elena said. "Which means someone planned this carefully, someone who wanted very specifically for the blame to land on me. Daemon, please, think about who would want that. Think about who benefits from my exile." For a long moment, silence stretched through the hall, and Elena allowed herself to hope again, that reason might prevail, that the king she loved might step back from the king duty, demanded him to be. Then a voice spoke from near the back of the hall, calm and measured, carrying easily across the tense quiet. "Perhaps," said Corin, stepping forward from where he had stood, watching silently among the assembled warriors. "The girl is simply frightened, and frightened people often reach for elaborate explanations, rather than accept the plain truth in front of them." Elena's eyes flicked toward him, and something in his composed, sympathetic expression sent an inexplicable chill through her, though she could not have said why in that moment. She had known Corin for years, had never had reason to distrust him, and yet something about the careful ease of his interjection struck her as wrong, in a way she could not yet articulate. "With respect, my king," Corin continued, "the pack has suffered greatly. The families of the fallen deserve resolution, not endless deliberation while a woman with clear evidence against her continues to walk freely among us, perhaps gathering more secrets even now." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd, grief and fear finding an easy target in the certainty Corin's words offered. Elena watched the mood of the hall shift further against her, felt the last threads of hope slipping away, as Daemon's expression hardened once more. "He's right," Daemon said, and something in his voice sounded almost relieved to have an excuse to end the deliberation, to stop looking at her pleading face, and simply act. "This has gone on long enough." He rose to his feet, and the full weight of his authority as Alpha King settled over the hall like a physical presence. "As Alpha King," he said, his voice ringing through the space with terrible finality, "I strip Elena of her rank, as Omega of this pack. She is no longer under our protection. She is no longer welcome within Packlands. She has until sundown to leave. Daemon." Her voice broke completely now, tears spilling down her face. "Please, I am your mate. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" His eyes met hers, and for just a moment, the king disappeared, and she saw the man underneath, drowning in grief and doubt and something that looked almost like fear. But then he blinked, and the king returned. "It meant everything to me," he said. "That is why this hurts as much as it does." He turned away from her, facing the window instead of her face, and Elena understood that the conversation was over. There would be no trial, no chance to defend herself further, no room for doubt to grow into mercy. The pack had decided. Their king had decided. She was a traitor now, whether she had betrayed anyone or not. The warriors led her out of the hall, past rows of pack members who watched her with a mixture of anger, sorrow, and confusion. A young girl named Charlotte, who Elena had once taught to braid her hair, reached out toward her before her mother pulled her back sharply. whispering something about staying away from traitors. As they walked her through the corridor, toward the main doors, memories rose unbidden in Elena's mind, unwelcome and painful in their contrast to the present horror. She remembered the night of her bonding ceremony, standing beneath torchlight in the courtyard, Damon's hands steady and warm as he marked her as his mate before the entire pack, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed others to see. She remembered him promising, in the quiet privacy of their chambers afterward, that nothing in this world would ever be allowed to come between them. She wondered, bitterly, whether he remembered that promise now, or whether grief had erased it, as thoroughly as it seemed to have erased his faith in her. Outside, the winter air bit at Elena's skin. Snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, as if the sky itself did not know the storm that was breaking apart inside her. She was given a small bag with a blanket, a water skin, and a loaf of bread. Nothing more. No coat beyond the one she wore. No weapon for protection. No explanation that anyone was willing to hear. She looked back once at the great stone house that had been her home, at the window on the second floor, where Damon's study overlooked the courtyard. She thought she saw a shadow standing there, watching her, but she could not be sure through the falling snow. "Move," one of the warriors said, not unkindly, but firmly. "The king's orders." Elena walked forward into the tree line, each step feeling heavier than the last, until the packlands disappeared behind her, and there was nothing left but forest, snow, and the terrible silence of being utterly alone. She did not look back again. She could not bear to see whether the shadow in the window was still there, or whether it had already turned away. As the light began to fade and the cold deepened, Elena's mind returned again and again to the note that had condemned her. Someone had written it in her handwriting. Someone had planted it, exactly where it would be found. Someone inside the pack, someone who knew her well enough to imitate her, had wanted her gone, and had used the deaths of 12 innocent warriors to make it happen. She thought, too, of the strange detail Damon had mentioned, the claim that she had encountered a stranger on the eastern path, and never spoken of it. She had no memory of any such encounter. And yet Damon had spoken of it with such certainty, as though he had heard it from a source he trusted completely. Someone had told him that lie, deliberately, to make her silence about it look like concealment, rather than simple absence of any such event. She did not know who. She did not know why, but she knew one thing, with absolute certainty, as she walked deeper into the darkening woods. She had been betrayed long before anyone accused her of betrayal, and the betrayal had been planned with a patience and precision that frightened her more than the cold ever could. Behind her, unseen, Damon stood at his window long after she disappeared into the trees. His hands were pressed flat against the cold glass, his knuckles white. His wolf paced inside him, snarling, confused, refusing to accept what his mind had just done. Every instinct in his body screamed that something was wrong, that the woman he loved would never harm this pack, that the evidence was too clean, too convenient, too perfectly aimed at destroying her. But grief has a way of silencing instinct. Loss has a way of demanding someone to blame. And Damon, in his rawest and most broken hour, had chosen to believe the parchment over the woman who had shared his bed, his laughter, his fears, and his future. He thought, too, of the detail about the stranger on the eastern path, the detail Corin had brought to him privately 2 days earlier, framed as a concerned observation, rather than an accusation. He had believed it without question at the time, trusting Corin's decade of loyal service. Now, standing alone in the aftermath of what he had just done, a small, uncomfortable doubt began to stir in the back of his mind, though he was not yet ready to examine it closely enough to understand what it meant. He did not yet know how wrong he was. He would not know for many weeks, and by the time he learned the truth, Elena would be fighting for her life in ways he could not yet imagine, hunted not only by the winter cold, but by the very person who had framed her in the first place. For now, though, he simply stood at the window, watching the empty tree line, wondering why his chest ached, as though something vital had just been torn out of it. Elena walked until her legs shook, and her breath came out in ragged clouds. The forest around her grew darker with each passing hour, the trees pressing closer together as though the world itself wanted to swallow her whole. She had grown up learning to survive in the wild, as most pack members did, but she had never had to do it completely alone, with no pack bond to draw strength from, no home to return to when the sun set. By nightfall, she found a hollow beneath the roots of an old oak tree, and pressed herself into it, wrapping the thin blanket around her shoulders. The cold seeped through anyway, settling into her bones. She hugged her knees to her chest, and finally allowed herself to cry, the sobs shaking her whole body, echoing softly into the empty woods, where no one could hear them, where no one was coming to comfort her. She thought of Damon's face in the hall, the flicker of doubt she had seen, and then watched disappear. She thought of the years they had spent together, the promises he had made her beneath the stars on the night they bonded. She thought of how easily all of that had been erased by a single piece of parchment and the desperate need of a grieving pack to find someone, anyone, to punish. "I didn't do this," she whispered into the darkness, as if saying it aloud might make it matter. "I didn't do this." The forest did not answer. The cold did not care. And somewhere far behind her, in the warm stone halls of the pack she had once called home, the true traitor slept soundly, believing the frame had worked perfectly, believing that Elena would either die in the winter woods or disappear forever, taking the truth with her. Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion finally pulling her under despite the fear and the cold. Her last conscious thought was not of anger, but of confusion, turning over and over the same unanswerable question. Who hated her enough to do this, and why? She did not know that the answer had been standing inside the pack's own walls for years, wearing a familiar face, waiting patiently for the right moment to destroy her. She did not know that her exile was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous plan. And she did not know that despite everything, despite the ice in his voice and the finality of his judgment, Damon Cross would not be able to sleep that night, haunted by the sound of her voice, begging him to believe her. Somewhere between duty and love, a king had made a terrible mistake. And somewhere in the frozen woods, an innocent woman was about to discover that surviving the cold would be the easiest part of what lay ahead of her. The first night passed, in fragments of shivering half-sleep. Elena woke every hour, certain she had heard footsteps, certain something was creeping closer through the dark. Each time, there was nothing but wind moving through bare branches and the distant call of an owl. By the time gray morning light filtered through the trees, she was no less afraid, but she was alive, and she told herself that was enough for now. She did not know where she was walking. She only knew she had to keep moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the look on Damon's face when he told her to leave. So she walked, following a frozen stream she hoped might lead to a village, or at least to fresh water and shelter better than a hollow beneath a tree. By midday, hunger gnawed at her stomach. She ate a small piece of the bread she had been given, forcing herself to save the rest, unsure when she would find more food. Her hands had gone numb hours ago. Her feet ached with every step. But she kept walking, because the alternative was to sit down in the snow and never get up again, and some stubborn part of her refused to let the people who had wronged her win that easily. As the sun began its slow descent behind the clouds, Elena spotted smoke rising in the distance, thin and gray against the white sky. Her heart leapt with a desperate, fragile hope, shelter, warmth, maybe even help. She did not yet know that the isolated cabin she was approaching belonged to a retired healer named Nathaniel, a man who had once served the Blackthorn Pack decades ago, before choosing a quieter life in the wilderness. She did not know that his kindness, offered without hesitation to a stranger stumbling out of the trees half-frozen, would become the first thread in a much larger unraveling of the lies that had destroyed her life. All she knew, as she staggered toward the small curl of smoke, was that for the first time since the council hall doors had slammed shut behind her, she allowed herself to believe that she might survive this after all. Behind her, the forest closed in silently, hiding the path she had taken, hiding the truth that would take many long and painful weeks to finally come to light. And far away, in a stone hall grown quiet with grief and doubt, an Alpha King sat alone, with a decision he could not undo, unaware that the woman he had cast out into the cold was still fighting, still breathing, still holding on to the truth he had refused to hear. The story of Elena's exile had only just begun, and the truth, patient and unwavering, was already waiting to be found. Nathaniel pulled the door open before Elena could even knock, as though some old instinct had told him someone was coming. He took one look at her, blue lips, trembling hands, snow crusted in her hair, and did not ask a single question. He simply stepped aside, and pulled her in out of the cold. "Sit," he said, guiding her toward the fire. "Talk later. Warm first." Elena obeyed, too exhausted to argue. She sank onto a wooden stool near the hearth and let the heat soak into her frozen skin. Nathaniel wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders and pressed a cup of hot broth into her hands. She drank it in silence, her body shaking with relief as much as cold. It was only after the shivering eased and color returned to her face that Nathaniel finally sat across from her, his sharp eyes studying her carefully. "Your pack," he said. "It was not a question. I can smell it on you, even faded as it is." "Blackthorn?" Elena's throat tightened. "I was," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Nathaniel's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a kind of careful attention settling over him. "Exiled," he said. "In winter. Alone. That's not a small punishment. What did they say you did?" She hesitated, half expecting him to throw her back out into the snow the moment she answered. But something about his calm, weathered face made her feel, for the first time in days, that she might actually be listened to. "They said I betrayed the pack," she said, "that I gave our patrol routes to the Ashford clan. 12 warriors died because of it. They found a note in my handwriting in the enemy camp." "And did you write it?" "No." Her voice cracked. "I've never even been near the Ashford border. I don't know how anyone could copy my handwriting so perfectly, but I swear to you, I never wrote that note." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, long enough that Elena began to fear he did not believe her either. Then he nodded slowly. "I served the Blackthorn pack for 30 years before I retired out here," he said. "I've seen good people accused of terrible things, because someone else needed a scapegoat. Grief makes people careless with the truth. It makes leaders desperate for someone to blame, so the pain has somewhere to go." "You believe me?" Elena asked, hardly daring to hope. "I don't know you," Nathaniel said honestly, "but I know fear when I see it, and I know guilt when I see it. And you, girl, are not wearing guilt. You're wearing grief. There's a difference." Elena felt tears sting her eyes again, this time from relief rather than despair. For the first time since the council hall, someone had looked at her and not immediately assumed the worst. "Rest here tonight," Nathaniel said, rising to fetch more blankets. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about what comes next. A frame this precise doesn't happen by accident. Someone wanted you gone badly enough to plan it carefully. That means someone inside your pack is not who they claim to be." Elena lay awake long after Nathaniel had gone to his own bed, staring at the low fire, turning his words over in her mind. Someone inside the pack. Someone who knew her handwriting well enough to forge it convincingly. Someone with access to patrol routes, and enough influence to make sure the evidence was found exactly where it would do the most damage. The list of people with that kind of access was not long, and the thought of who might be capable of such cruelty sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The following morning brought pale sunlight and a stillness to the forest that felt almost peaceful after the terror of the previous days. Nathaniel set Elena to work almost immediately, insisting that idle hands invited idle grief, and Elena found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was grateful for the distraction. She learned to sort dried herbs by their scent alone, to recognize the difference between roots that healed and roots that harmed, to grind bark into powder fine enough for tea. "You have steady hands," Nathaniel observed one afternoon, watching her work. "Steadier than most people I've trained. Did you have any healing knowledge before you came here?" "A little," Elena admitted. "I used to help prepare remedies for wounded warriors after skirmishes. Nothing as thorough as this." "Then you'll learn quickly." He handed her another jar to sort. "Idle hands and idle minds are the two things that will destroy you fastest out here. Keep both busy, and you'll survive far longer than you think." Over the following days, Elena helped Nathaniel gather firewood, learned where he kept his herbs, and listened as he shared stories of his years serving the pack, including names and faces from years before Elena had even joined as a young Omega. He spoke of alphas long since past, of battles fought and treaties negotiated, of the slow, careful work of keeping a pack alive through generations of change. "Damon's father was a good man," Nathaniel said one evening, staring into the fire. "Stubborn, though, slow to trust, quick to judge when he believed someone had wronged the pack. I see some of that same fire in his son, for better and for worse. Elena said nothing, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest. She did not want to believe that Damon's judgment against her had come from some inherited flaw, rather than a mistake born purely of grief. She wanted to believe, still, despite everything, that the man she loved would find his way back to reason eventually. "You still love him," Nathaniel said, not unkindly, watching her face in the firelight, "even after what he did." "I don't know how to stop," Elena admitted quietly. "Is that foolish of me?" "Love rarely listens to reason," Nathaniel said. "It's not foolish. It's simply human, or wolf, or whatever we choose to call ourselves out here in the woods, where labels matter less than survival." He paused, then added more seriously, "But loving him doesn't mean you owe him blind forgiveness. Whatever happens next, remember that. You are allowed to want the truth cleared, and still hold him accountable for how quickly he was willing to believe the worst of you." Elena nodded slowly, letting the words settle into place beside the ache still lodged deep in her chest. "You can't clear your name from exile," Nathaniel told her one evening, as they sat by the fire. "But you can gather what you need out here, quietly, carefully, until you have enough truth that even a king, blinded by grief, cannot ignore it." "He already made his choice," Elena said bitterly. "He didn't even try to hear me." "Grief makes fools of even good men," Nathaniel said. "That doesn't excuse what he did, but it also doesn't mean he'll stay a fool forever. People wake up, Elena. Sometimes it just takes the right truth, delivered at the right moment, to shake them loose from their own certainty." Elena did not know if she believed that Damon would ever wake up. The image of his cold, unwavering face in the council hall haunted her, more than the winter cold ever could, but she held on to Nathaniel's words anyway, because they were the only thread of hope she had left, and in the depths of exile, even a fragile thread was enough to keep walking forward. As the days turned into a second week, Elena began keeping a small record of her own, borrowing scraps of parchment from Nathaniel's modest supply, writing down everything she could remember about the days leading up to the ambush, hoping that somewhere in her own memory lay a detail that might eventually prove useful. She wrote of the Eastern Path, of the herbs she had gathered there, of every person she had spoken with in the weeks before the attack, searching her own recollection for anything that might explain how someone had learned enough about her habits to forge her handwriting so convincingly. Nothing came to her immediately, but she kept writing anyway, because writing gave her grief somewhere to go, besides the hollow ache in her chest, and because some stubborn part of her refused to simply wait passively for rescue that might never come. Meanwhile, back within the walls of the Blackthorn pack, the mood had not improved with Elena's absence, as many had expected it would. If anything, a strange unease had settled over the pack in the weeks since her exile. Warriors who had once trusted each other completely now eyed one another with quiet suspicion. Rumors began to circulate, not of Elena's guilt, but of doubt. A young warrior named Oliver, who had trained alongside Elena for years, was overheard in the barracks questioning how she could have possibly slipped away long enough to meet with Ashford scouts without anyone noticing, given how closely Omegas were kept within Packlands. Others began to whisper about how quickly the evidence had been found, how neatly it had all come together, almost too neatly for a woman who had never shown so much as a flicker of disloyalty in the 2 years she had lived among them. Damon heard none of these whispers directly. He had thrown himself into pack business with a grim, joyless intensity, avoiding his own chambers as much as possible, because her absence there felt like a wound that refused to close. He told himself he had done the right thing, the necessary thing, the thing any responsible Alpha King would have done in the face of such evidence. But sleep did not come easily, and when it did come, it brought dreams of Elena's face in the council hall, her voice breaking as she begged him to believe her, the flicker of hope in her eyes when she thought, for just a moment, that he might listen. He woke from these dreams each time with his chest aching and his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin, and he told himself, every single time, that the feeling would fade with time. It did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper with each passing day, an itch beneath his skin that no amount of duty or grief could fully silence. 3 weeks after Elena's exile, cracks began to show in the pack that had once seemed so unshakable. Patrol schedules fell into disarray without her quiet efficiency managing supply routes. Meals in the Great Hall felt emptier, quieter, as though something essential had been removed from the very rhythm of daily life. Even warriors who had never spoken more than a few words to Elena found themselves glancing toward the empty seat beside the king's chair, uncertain why its emptiness bothered them so much. Grace, the elder who had presented the damning note in the council hall, found herself troubled by a detail she had not spoken aloud to anyone. The parchment had been remarkably clean for something supposedly torn during a chaotic ambush. No blood, no dirt, no signs of the violence that had claimed 12 lives that night. She told herself it meant nothing. Paper could survive many things, but the thought lingered in the back of her mind like a splinter she could not quite remove. One evening, unable to shake the discomfort, Grace visited the archive room where the note had been stored following the council's judgment, intending simply to look at it once more, to reassure herself that her doubts were foolish. She found the parchment exactly where it had been filed, and studied it closely under lamplight for the first time since the hearing. The ink, she noticed now, sat slightly differently across certain words than others, as though written in two separate sittings rather than a single continuous hand. It was a small thing, easily missed by anyone not looking specifically for inconsistency, but Grace had spent decades reading treaties and contracts, and her eye for such details had been sharpened by years of careful practice. She said nothing to anyone that night, uncertain what the observation truly meant, unwilling to raise false hope or false accusation without more to support it. But she began, quietly, to watch the pack more closely than she had before, paying attention to details she might otherwise have dismissed. A pack enforcer named Corin moved through these weeks with careful, practiced calm. He attended council meetings, offered sympathetic words about the tragedy of Elena's betrayal, and quietly ensured that no one asked too many questions about how the note had been discovered in the Ashford camp so quickly after the attack, or why he happened to be the one leading the search party that found it. Corin had served the Blackthorn pack for nearly a decade, rising steadily through the ranks, always dependable, always present at exactly the right moments. Few people thought to question a man who had given so many years of loyal service. That, precisely, was what made him dangerous. His resentment toward Elena had begun long before the ambush, rooted in a bitterness few in the pack understood. He had wanted the position of second enforcer beneath the king, a position Daemon had instead given to a younger warrior with less experience but sharper instincts, a decision made partly on Elena's quiet recommendation after she noticed the younger warrior's talent during a training exercise. Corin had smiled and congratulated the appointment publicly. Privately, the insult festered for months, twisting into something far darker than simple professional disappointment. He remembered, with a clarity that still made his jaw clench even now, the exact moment he had learned the appointment would not be his. He had served faithfully for years, had bled for this pack more times than he cared to count, and yet a younger warrior, with a fraction of his experience, had been chosen instead, all because Elena, an Omega with no formal authority whatsoever, had whispered a favorable word in the king's ear. The unfairness of it had gnawed at him for months, growing sharper with every small slight, real or imagined, until it had calcified into something he no longer recognized as simple jealousy. When the opportunity arose to weaken the pack's trust in Elena, while simultaneously eliminating warriors he viewed as obstacles to his own ambitions, Corin had taken it without hesitation. The ambush had been his design from the beginning, information fed carefully to the Ashford clan through an intermediary, timed precisely so that the blame could be shifted entirely onto an innocent woman who had never suspected the depth of his resentment. The forging of her handwriting had taken months of careful study, collected from old training reports and supply requisitions she had signed over the years, practiced late at night in the privacy of his own quarters, until he could reproduce the particular slant of her letters, the way she crossed certain characters with a small flourish she likely did not even realize she made. It had been tedious, painstaking work, but Corin had never been a man to rush an important task. He watched Daemon closely in the weeks following Elena's exile, waiting for any sign that the king's resolve might weaken. When Daemon began spending long hours locked away in his study, refusing visitors, staring at nothing, Corin allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. The plan was working exactly as intended. What Corin did not anticipate was the presence of a servant named Lily, who had quietly admired Elena's kindness during her time in the pack, and who found herself unable to simply move on the way everyone else seemed to expect. Lily began asking careful, indirect questions among the other servants, about the night of the ambush, about who had access to Elena's private chambers in the days before the attack, about who might have had reason enough to want her gone. Lily had worked in the Blackthorn stronghold since she was a young girl, invisible in the way servants often became to those they served, moving through corridors and rooms unnoticed, overhearing conversations never meant for her ears. She had always liked Elena, who, unlike many other pack members, had never treated her as though her presence in a room did not matter. Elena had asked after her sick mother more than once, had shared small kindnesses that cost nothing but meant everything to someone so rarely acknowledged. The accusation against Elena had never sat right with Lily, though she could not have explained precisely why, beyond a persistent feeling in her gut that refused to quiet. So she began, quietly and carefully, to pay closer attention. Her questions drew little attention at first, but slowly, quietly, threads began to gather, threads that would eventually need only the right hand to pull them together into something undeniable. Damon remained unaware of these quiet undercurrents moving through his own pack. His days blurred into a gray monotony of duty and grief, his nights haunted by dreams he could not escape. He found himself, more than once, standing outside the closed door of Elena's chambers, hand raised as though to knock, before remembering with a fresh wave of pain that there was no one inside to answer. He threw himself instead into matters of pack security, doubling patrols along the eastern ridge, tightening protocols meant to prevent any future ambush, as though sufficient vigilance now might somehow undo the losses already suffered. The warriors under his command noticed the change in him, a harder edge to his commands, a shorter temper than the one they remembered from before the tragedy. Few dared question it aloud, though many wondered privately whether their king was punishing himself as much as he believed he was protecting the pack. It was on one such gray afternoon, weeks after Elena's exile, that he finally forced himself to do what he had been avoiding since the day she left. He walked to her chambers. The door had remained locked since her exile, her belongings untouched, a silent shrine to the life he had cast out into the winter cold. He told himself he needed to have her things cleared out, boxed away, or given to those in need, so the room could be repurposed and the pack could move forward. He told himself this was simply practical. He did not fully believe his own reasoning, but he opened the door anyway. The room smelled faintly of the lavender oil Elena used to keep in a small bottle by her bed. The scent hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway, unable to move further inside. Sunlight filtered weakly through the frosted window, illuminating dust motes drifting in the cold, still air. He crossed to her wardrobe first, pulling out dresses and cloaks with mechanical efficiency, folding them carefully despite himself, unable to simply toss aside things she had once worn against her skin. It was slow, painful work, made worse by every small object that reminded him of her presence: a hairpin left on the dresser, a half-finished embroidery abandoned on a chair, a book with a pressed flower marking her page. He paused over a small wooden box on her dresser, one he recognized as a gift he had given her during their first winter together, carved with a pattern of intertwined leaves that had taken a traveling craftsman weeks to complete. Inside, he found pressed flowers from their bonding ceremony, a ribbon that had once tied her hair, and a small folded drawing done in a child's careless hand, a gift from Charlotte from some forgotten afternoon. Elena had kept it all these years, small treasures of a life he had dismissed so easily, in a single afternoon of grief and fury. He was nearly finished with the wardrobe when his foot caught against a slightly raised floorboard near the bed. He might have ignored it entirely if the wood had not shifted so distinctly beneath his weight, a small give that spoke of something hidden beneath rather than simple wear. Kneeling, he pried the board loose with careful fingers, and beneath it, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth to protect it from dust, he found a leather-bound journal. His hands went still. He should have called for a servant to catalog the item, should have set it aside for the council's records, should have done any number of proper procedural things. Instead, he sat down on the edge of her abandoned bed, the journal heavy in his hands, and opened it to the first page. Her handwriting greeted him immediately, familiar and achingly personal, and beneath it, a single line written nearly 2 years ago, shortly after their bonding ceremony. "I never thought I would be loved like this. I am afraid every single day that I will somehow fail to deserve it." Damon's breath caught in his throat. He turned the page, and then the next, and then the next, unable to stop himself even as something inside his chest began to crack wide open. Page after page revealed a woman entirely unlike the traitor the council had condemned. She wrote of her fear of disappointing him, of her joy at small moments they had shared, private jokes, and quiet mornings that Damon remembered with painful clarity now that he saw them reflected back through her eyes. She wrote of the pack with a devotion that bordered on reverence, describing the warriors by name, worrying over their injuries, celebrating their victories as though they were her own family. One entry, dated over a year earlier, described a night when Damon had returned from a difficult negotiation with a neighboring pack, exhausted and frustrated by hours of fruitless argument. Elena had written of sitting with him in silence until he was ready to speak, of the small satisfaction she felt when he finally let his guard down enough to laugh again over something trivial she had said. He remembered that night clearly now, remembered the relief of her quiet presence beside him, and felt fresh grief twist through his chest at how completely he had forgotten, in his fury, the countless small kindnesses that had built their life together. Another entry described her fear during a skirmish that had left several warriors wounded, her hands shaking as she helped prepare remedies late into the night, her private worry that she might not be doing enough, that her contribution felt small compared to the warriors who fought and bled for the pack directly. Damon had never known she carried such doubts. She had always seemed steady to him, capable, certain of her place within the pack. He realized now how much of her inner struggle she had kept hidden from him, perhaps out of a fear that sharing it would make her seem weak, or perhaps simply because he had never asked closely enough to invite such honesty. There was no hatred in these pages, no resentment, no hint of betrayal simmering beneath the surface of the life she had shared with him. Damon read late into the night, unable to stop, unable to look away from the truth unfolding before him, one careful entry at a time. Somewhere around midnight, his hands trembling now, he reached an entry dated only 4 days before the ambush that had destroyed 12 lives and ended, indirectly, the life Elena had known. I was stopped today on the eastern path by a man I did not recognize. He knew my name. He knew things about the pack he should not have known, patrol schedules, guard rotations, details that felt far too specific for a stranger to simply guess. He told me that if I did not deliver false information to him, information he claimed would only mislead outside scouts and cause no real harm, he would hurt my family in the village beyond the border. I do not know what to do. I am afraid to tell Damon, afraid he will think less of me for being so easily threatened, afraid of what might happen if I refuse. I told the man I needed time to think. I do not know if that was the right choice. Damon's blood ran cold. He turned the page immediately, his hands no longer entirely steady. The next entry, dated 2 days before the ambush, was shorter, more frantic in its handwriting. He came again today. I told him I would not help him. I told him I would go straight to Damon and tell him everything. He laughed at me and said it would not matter, that by the time anyone believed me, it would already be too late. I am frightened. I think I need to tell Damon tonight, no matter what he thinks of me for waiting this long. The final relevant entry, dated the night of the ambush itself, was barely legible, written in a rush, the ink smudged in places as though written in haste or through tears. I went to find Damon tonight to tell him everything, but he was in council and could not be disturbed. I left word with the guard at his door that I needed to speak with him urgently. I do not know if the message reached him. I am afraid something terrible is about to happen, and I could not stop it in time. Damon sat frozen on the edge of the bed, the journal open in his lap, his entire body trembling with a mixture of horror and dawning, devastating comprehension. She had tried to warn him. She had gone to his very door the night of the attack, desperate to tell him the truth, and somehow that warning had never reached him. Someone had stopped that message from being delivered. The realization settled over him like a physical weight, crushing the breath from his lungs. He had condemned her, banished her into the winter wilderness, destroyed everything they had built together, based on evidence forged by the very person who had threatened her into silence and then ensured her warning never reached him in time. He thought suddenly, sharply, of the false detail Corin had brought to him days before the council hearing, the claim that Elena had encountered a stranger on the eastern path and said nothing of it. At the time, he had believed it proved her guilt, evidence of secrets kept. Now, reading her own words describing exactly such an encounter, exactly such a threat, He understood the truth had been twisted into its opposite, transformed from evidence of her fear into evidence of her supposed betrayal, and he understood, with a sickening lurch, precisely who had done the twisting. He closed the journal with shaking hands and pressed it against his chest, and for the first time since he had become Alpha King, Damon Cross allowed himself to weep. Dawn found Damon still awake, the journal resting on the desk before him, its pages marked with small strips of cloth where he had reread certain entries so many times he feared the ink might wear away beneath his fingers. His grief had shifted overnight into something sharper, something with purpose. Guilt still clawed at his chest, but beneath it now burned a determination to undo the terrible mistake he had made. He summoned the head of his personal guard, before the sun had fully risen, demanding to know which guard had been stationed at his study door on the night of the ambush. The answer came quickly: a young warrior named Edward, who had served faithfully for several years and had no history of disloyalty that anyone could recall. Damon had Edward brought before him privately, away from the council, away from any ears that might carry word back to whoever had orchestrated this nightmare. Edward entered nervously, clearly aware that something serious was happening, though he did not yet know what. "The night of the ambush," Damon said, his voice carefully controlled despite the storm raging beneath his calm exterior. "Elena came to my study door. She told you she needed to speak with me urgently. What happened to that message?" Edward's face paled instantly, and in that single reaction, Damon knew he had found the first thread of truth. "My king, Edward stammered, his eyes darting toward the door, as though searching for an escape that did not exist. "Tell me the truth," Damon said, his voice low and dangerous now, all traces of gentleness gone. "I will know if you lie to me." Edward's shoulders sagged, defeat settling over him visibly. "Corin came to me that night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He told me the message was not important, that Elena was simply anxious and overreacting, and that I should not disturb you during council for something so trivial. He gave me coin to ensure I understood how trivial it truly was. I did not think anything of it at the time, my king. I swear it. Corin has always been trusted, always respected. I had no reason to doubt him." Damon's hands curled into fists on the desk before him, his knuckles white with barely contained fury. "You let an innocent woman's warning go unheard, because a bribe convinced you it did not matter," he said. "Because of your silence, 12 warriors died, and my mate was exiled into the winter wilderness for a crime she did not commit." Edward dropped to his knees, genuine horror dawning across his face, as the full weight of what he had done settled over him. "I did not know, my king. I swear to you, I did not know what it would cost. If I had understood, I would never have—" "Corin," Damon said, cutting him off, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. "Where is he now?" "In the barracks, my king, preparing for the morning patrol rotation, as far as I know." Damon rose from his desk, the journal clutched tightly in one hand, rage and grief and desperate hope warring within him in equal measure. "Say nothing of this conversation to anyone," he told Edward. "Not yet. If Corin suspects we know the truth before we have proof enough to hold before the full council, he may run, or worse, he may act to silence anyone who could expose him." Edward nodded frantically, still trembling. "Yes, my king. I understand. What will happen to me?" Damon paused at the door, his expression unreadable. "That depends on how honestly you help me now correct what your silence allowed to happen. Go about your duties as though nothing has changed. If Corin asks whether anyone has questioned you, tell him no. Can you do that?" "Yes, my king," Edward said, though his voice still trembled with shame. Damon left him kneeling there and moved swiftly through the corridors of his own stronghold, his mind racing through everything he now understood. Corin had bribed a guard to silence Elena's warning. Corin had likely been involved in feeding information to the Ashford clan, ensuring the ambush succeeded exactly as planned. Corin had almost certainly been the one to plant the forged note in the enemy camp, timing its discovery perfectly to frame Elena for a crime orchestrated entirely by his own hand. But suspicion, however strong, was not proof enough to overturn a council ruling and clear Elena's name before the entire pack. Damon needed more. He needed to understand the full scope of Corin's betrayal, needed evidence solid enough that no elder, no warrior, no member of the pack could continue to doubt Elena's innocence once it was revealed. He spent the following days moving carefully, quietly gathering what he could without alerting Corin to his growing suspicion. He questioned other guards who had been on duty during the weeks leading up to the ambush, learning of strange absences from Corin's usual patrol routes, unexplained meetings near the eastern border, where Elena had described being confronted by a stranger. He questioned the scribes who had originally compared Elena's handwriting to the forged note, learning that one had been pressured by Corin to confirm the match quickly, without the careful scrutiny such an accusation should have demanded. One scribe, an older woman named Margaret who had served the Pack's records for over 20 years, admitted with visible discomfort that Corin had visited her privately before the council hearing, praising her skill and expressing confidence that she alone among the scribes possessed the expertise to confirm the match quickly, sparing the grieving Pack unnecessary delay. She had felt flattered at the time, eager to prove herself worthy of such praise, and had rushed her examination in a way she now deeply regretted. "I should have looked more closely," she told Damon, her voice heavy with guilt. "There were inconsistencies I noticed even then, small things I dismissed because I was eager to provide the certainty everyone seemed to want. I am sorry, my king. I let my own pride cloud my judgment." Damon found he could not fully blame her. Grief had clouded everyone's judgment in those terrible days following the ambush, his own most of all. But her admission added another crucial piece to the growing picture of deliberate manipulation Corin had orchestrated, with careful, patient precision. Each piece fit into the growing puzzle, like a picture slowly resolving into terrible clarity. Corin had planned this meticulously, using years of trusted service to shield himself from suspicion, while systematically destroying the woman he resented, and the warriors who stood between him and the position he believed he deserved. Lily, the servant who had quietly gathered her own threads of doubt in the weeks since Elena's exile, found her way to Damon during this time as well, drawn by rumors that the king had begun asking unusual questions. She approached him cautiously one evening, uncertain whether her observations, gathered from overheard conversations and small inconsistencies noticed while cleaning rooms she was rarely acknowledged within, would carry any weight with a king she had never spoken to directly before. "My king," she said, curtsying nervously in the doorway of his study. "I do not know if this matters, but I have noticed things these past weeks that troubled me, and I did not know who else to tell." Damon, exhausted from days of careful investigation, found himself grateful for any additional thread of truth. "Speak freely," he said. "Whatever you have noticed, I want to hear it." Lily shared what she had learned, small observations from other servants about Corin's strange behavior in the days surrounding the ambush, a torn scrap of cloth found near the eastern path that matched a cloak Corin had reported losing around the same time, and a conversation she had overheard weeks earlier between two guards discussing an unfamiliar visitor who had met briefly with Corin near the stables late one night, shortly before the ambush occurred. "I did not think much of it at the time," Lily admitted. "Corin meets with many people in his position, but after everything that happened to Elena, I could not stop wondering." Damon thanked her sincerely, promising that her courage in coming forward would not be forgotten, and Lily left feeling, for the first time in her years of quiet, unacknowledged service, that she had truly mattered to something important. By the end of the week, Damon possessed enough scattered evidence to feel confident in the truth, even if he lacked the single undeniable proof that would satisfy the council entirely. But time, he realized with mounting dread, was no longer a luxury he could afford. Corin, sensing perhaps some shift in the atmosphere of the Pack, some subtle change in how certain guards and servants looked at him, had begun making arrangements of his own. He could not know exactly what Damon had discovered, but years of careful instinct told him that something had shifted, that the ground beneath his carefully constructed lies had begun to tremble. He noticed it first in small ways. Edward, usually quick to greet him warmly in passing, now found reasons to avoid direct eye contact. Margaret, the scribe who had once basked in his praise, seemed to flinch slightly whenever their paths crossed in the corridors. Even the king himself, on the rare occasions their duties brought them into the same room, seemed to study him with a careful, assessing quality that had not been present before. Corin told himself he was imagining it, that grief and paranoia were making him see suspicion where none existed. But the feeling would not fully leave him, and a man who had spent a decade building a career on careful attention to detail could not simply ignore his own instincts now, however inconvenient they had become. He began, quietly, to prepare an exit. He gathered coin he had hidden away over the years, supplies that could sustain him on a long journey away from Blackthorn lands, and made careful note of which border crossings remained least guarded should he need to disappear quickly. He told himself these were simply precautions, the reasonable actions of a careful man, nothing more. But precaution alone would not be enough if Elena remained alive somewhere out in the wilderness, carrying knowledge of the threats made against her, carrying suspicion that could eventually unravel everything he had built. If she ever found her way back to the pack, or if her account of the stranger who had threatened her on the eastern path ever reached ears willing to investigate closely enough, the careful frame he had constructed would collapse entirely. And so, while Damon gathered evidence within the walls of the pack, Corin made a decision that would prove far more dangerous than anything he had done before. Elena needed to disappear permanently, before suspicion could ever fully form against him, before the fragile threads Lily and Grace and Margaret had begun to notice could be woven together into something undeniable. He gathered 2 loyal warriors, men who owed him favors from years of quiet manipulation and careful bribery, men named Christopher and Nathan, who had each, at different times, benefited from Corin's willingness to overlook minor infractions in exchange for future loyalty. He met with them privately in the early hours before dawn, well away from the barracks where curious ears might overhear. "I need a task handled quietly," Corin told them, his voice carrying the calm authority that had always made men trust him without question. "There is a woman living somewhere in the eastern woods, likely sheltering with a retired healer. She poses a danger to this pack that the council does not yet fully understand. I need her found, and I need the matter handled permanently, before she can cause further harm." Christopher shifted uncomfortably. "Handled how, exactly?" "However necessary," Corin said, his tone leaving little room for further clarification. "You will be well rewarded for your discretion, and for your success." Nathan, hungrier for advancement than his companion, nodded without further hesitation. "We'll find her." The trail was cold after so many weeks, but not impossible to follow for men skilled in tracking, especially with rumors circulating about a strange woman who had recently taken shelter with a healer, living alone in the eastern woods. Merchants passing through the region had spoken of it in taverns along the border, small talk exchanged over ale, never imagining the danger such casual gossip might eventually bring to the woman they described. Christopher and Nathan departed before the sun had fully risen, moving swiftly and quietly through territory Corin had marked carefully, on a rough map drawn from his own knowledge of the region. They carried with them the confidence of men who had never failed a task Corin had set before them, unaware that this particular task would prove far more difficult than any they had previously undertaken. Damon, unaware of the danger closing in around Elena from a direction he had not anticipated, spent his nights poring over her journal and his days quietly building the case against Corin, driven by a desperate need to make things right before it was too late. He did not yet know how close that deadline truly was. It was Grace, still troubled by the inconsistencies she had noticed in the forged note, who finally brought Damon the piece of evidence he needed to move against Corin without further delay. She arrived at his study late one evening, the parchment carefully wrapped in cloth, her expression grave. "My king," she said, "I believe I have found something significant. The ink on this note was applied in 2 separate sittings, not one continuous hand. I do not know what it means precisely, but I believe it deserves your attention." Damon examined the note closely under lamplight, comparing it against the pages of Elena's journal spread open on his desk. Grace was right. The slight variation in ink density, subtle but undeniable once pointed out, suggested exactly what Damon now suspected, that the note had been carefully constructed over time by someone practicing to perfect their forgery, rather than written in the frantic urgency of a single moment, as the council had assumed. "Thank you, Grace," Damon said quietly. "This confirms what I have feared for days now. Elena did not write this note. Corin did, or had it written under his direction, forging her hand with careful, deliberate practice." Grace's face paled as the full weight of the accusation settled over her. "Corin," she repeated, horror creeping into her voice. "My king, if this is true, then we condemned an innocent woman, based on his lies, and the true traitor has walked freely among us ever since, respected and trusted, while she suffered in exile for his crimes. Yes, Daemon said grimly, and I fear he may already suspect that his lies are beginning to unravel. We do not have much time left before he acts to protect himself further. He was right to fear it. Even as they spoke, Christopher and Nathan were already deep into the eastern woods, drawing steadily closer to the small cabin, where Elena had finally begun to find some measure of peace, unaware entirely of the danger approaching through the trees. Daemon summoned Grace, and a small handful of warriors he trusted absolutely, men who had served alongside him since his own training years, and whose loyalty he had never once had reason to doubt. He explained everything: the journal, Edward's confession, Margaret's admission, the inconsistencies in the forged note, and watched their expressions shift from disbelief to horror to grim determination as the truth settled over them. We move against Corin tonight, Daemon said, quietly. I do not want him alerted before we have him fully secured. But before that, I need to find Elena. If Corin suspects his lies are unraveling, he may already have sent someone to silence her. The thought sent ice through his veins, sharper and more terrifying than anything he had felt even in the depths of his grief over the ambush. He had already failed her once, catastrophically, and the thought of failing her again, permanently, in a way that could never be undone, drove him from his study, before the warriors had even finished gathering their weapons. My king, one of the warriors said carefully, should we not secure Corin first, before he can act further? There is no time, Daemon said, already moving toward the stables. If he has sent men after her, every moment we spend securing him here is a moment closer to her death. Corin can be dealt with once she is safe. She cannot be brought back if we are too late. He rode out within the hour. Following the general direction Elena's journal suggested she might have traveled after her exile, based on descriptions of landmarks she had mentioned in passing during their years together, memories of conversations about the eastern woods that took on new significance, now that he searched them desperately for any clue to her location. Nathaniel's cabin had become, over the weeks, something closer to a home than Elena had expected it to. She had regained her strength fully now, her days filled with useful work, gathering herbs, tending the small garden Nathaniel kept even through the cold months, learning the healing knowledge he seemed endlessly willing to share. The nightmares of the council hall still visited her some nights, but they came less often now, softened by the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilding itself in exile. She had begun, in recent days, to allow herself small moments of hope, imagining a future that did not depend entirely on Daemon's forgiveness or the pack's acceptance, a life built instead on her own skills and Nathaniel's steady friendship. It was a smaller life than the one she had lost, but it was honest, and it was hers, and for the first time since her exile, she found herself thinking of the future without immediate dread. She had not forgotten Daemon. She thought of him often, in unguarded moments, wondering whether he ever regretted the swiftness of his judgment, wondering whether some part of him missed her the way she still, despite everything, missed him. She told herself these feelings were foolish, that a man who could cast her out so completely did not deserve her continued devotion. But the heart, she had learned, rarely listened to reason. You're thinking of him again, Nathaniel observed one morning, watching her stare out the frosted window while her tea grew cold in her hands. Elena flushed slightly, embarrassed to be caught so easily. Is it that obvious? You get a particular look, Nathaniel said, amusement softening his weathered features, somewhere between longing and anger. It's not an easy combination to hide. I hate that I still think of him at all, Elena admitted. After everything he did. Love and hate aren't always as separate as people like to believe, Nathaniel said. Sometimes they grow from the same root. Doesn't make either feeling less real. It was on a cold, clear morning that everything changed again. Elena had gone alone to gather water from the stream a short distance from the cabin, a task she performed daily without concern, having grown familiar with the surrounding woods over the past weeks. She was kneeling by the water's edge, filling her container, when she heard the snap of a branch behind her, too deliberate to be an animal, too careful to be Nathaniel simply approaching. She turned just in time to see two unfamiliar men emerging from the tree line, their expressions cold and purposeful, in a way that sent immediate alarm through her body. Elena of Blackthorn, one of them said, his voice flat and businesslike. Corin sends his regards. Her blood ran cold at the name. She had no proof of Corin's involvement in her exile, Only vague suspicions she had never had the opportunity to fully investigate, but hearing his name spoken with such casual menace confirmed something she had feared, without fully allowing herself to believe. "What do you want?" she asked, backing slowly away, her mind racing for any possible escape. "Nothing personal," the second man said, stepping closer. "Just tying up loose ends." Elena did not wait to hear more. She turned and ran, abandoning the water container, sprinting through the trees toward the cabin, as fast as her legs would carry her, her heart hammering with a terror sharper than anything she had felt even on the night of her exile. Behind her, she heard the men give chase, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. She burst through the cabin door, gasping out a warning to Nathaniel, who reacted with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced danger many times before in his long life. He grabbed a walking staff that Elena had not realized doubled as a weapon and positioned himself between her and the door. "There's a hidden path behind the cabin," he said quickly, his voice low and urgent. "Leads to a ravine too narrow for grown men to follow easily. Go now." "I'll hold them as long as I can." "I won't leave you," Elena protested, but Nathaniel was already pushing her toward the back door with surprising strength. "You will," he said firmly, "because if you don't survive this, then everything that happened to you means nothing. Go, Elena. Find someone who can help you. Find the truth. I'll be right behind you." Elena fled through the back door, as the front door burst open behind her, the sound of Nathaniel's staff cracking against something solid following her into the trees. She ran without looking back, tears streaming down her face, the narrow ravine path twisting sharply between rock walls that scraped against her shoulders as she pushed forward, desperate and terrified. She did not know how long she ran, or how far, before her legs finally gave out, and she collapsed against a boulder, gasping for breath, straining to hear any sound of pursuit. The forest around her had gone eerily silent, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart. It was then, in the sudden quiet, that she heard hoofbeats approaching from the opposite direction, fast and urgent. Panic surged through her again, and she scrambled to hide behind the boulder, pressing herself flat against the cold stone, praying whoever approached was not another of Corin's men come to finish what the first two had started. Her mind raced through every possibility, wondering if she should try to flee further, wondering if hiding would even be enough against wolves who could track her scent regardless of how carefully she concealed herself. The horse skidded to a stop nearby, and a familiar voice called out into the trees, a voice she had not expected to hear ever again, a voice that broke something loose in her chest even amid the terror of the moment. "Elena." She peered cautiously around the boulder and saw Damon dismounting swiftly, his eyes scanning the trees with desperate intensity, a leather journal clutched tightly against his side. He looked different than she remembered, exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical fatigue, weeks of grief and guilt etched into features that had once seemed so certain, so unshakable. "Damon?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, disbelief warring with a fragile, painful hope. He turned toward the sound instantly, and the moment their eyes met, something in his face crumbled entirely, relief and grief and love, all crashing together at once. "I found your journal," he said, closing the distance between them in swift, urgent strides. "I know the truth, Elena. I know what Corin did to you. I know you tried to warn me. I am so sorry. I should have listened. I should have trusted you from the very first moment." Elena's legs gave out beneath her, and Damon caught her before she fully collapsed, holding her tightly against his chest as she wept, exhaustion and relief and lingering terror overwhelming her all at once. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply holding on to each other, as though afraid the other might disappear if they let go too soon. "Nathaniel," she gasped out after a moment, pulling back sharply. "Corin's men. They're at the cabin. He stayed behind to give me time to run. Damon, we have to help him." Damon's jaw tightened with renewed purpose. "Show me the way," he said. They moved quickly back toward the cabin, Damon's wolf senses guiding them through the trees with far greater speed than Elena could have managed alone. As they approached, the sound of a struggle reached them, wood splintering, a grunt of pain, and Elena's heart clenched with fear that they might already be too late. They emerged from the trees to find Nathaniel bloodied but still standing, having driven one attacker back with fierce blows from his staff, while the second circled cautiously, wary of the old healer's unexpected strength. Nathan, the hungrier and more reckless of the two, lunged forward just as Damon and Elena broke through the tree line, his blade catching Nathaniel a shallow but painful cut along his forearm. Damon did not hesitate. He shifted mid-stride, his wolf form crashing into the nearest attacker with overwhelming force, ending the struggle in a matter of moments. Christopher, seeing his companion overwhelmed so swiftly, turned to flee, but Damon was faster, cutting off his escape and pinning him against a tree with a snarl that left no room for further resistance. Elena rushed to Nathaniel's side, tearing a strip of cloth from her own sleeve to press against his wound, her hands shaking but steady enough to do what needed to be done. "You held them off," she said, relief and gratitude thick in her voice. "You saved my life." "Told you I'd manage," Nathaniel said, wincing slightly as she tightened the makeshift bandage, though his eyes crinkled with a tired, satisfied humor, despite the pain. "Where is Corin?" Damon demanded, shifting back to his human form just enough to speak clearly, his voice carrying an authority that left the trembling Christopher no room to refuse. "At the Packlands," the man stammered, terror plain on his face. "He sent us ahead. He said if we succeeded, he would reward us. If we failed, he said he would deal with the consequences himself, before anyone could connect it back to him." Damon's expression darkened further, understanding immediately what that meant. Corin, sensing the danger closing in, would already be preparing to cover his tracks, perhaps even preparing to flee, before Damon could return, with proof strong enough to expose him before the full council. "Bind them," Damon ordered the small escort of warriors who had followed him from the Packlands, men he had brought quietly, trusting only those he was certain remained loyal. "We ride back immediately. Corin cannot be allowed to escape justice for what he has done." Elena, still shaking from the terror of the chase, looked toward Nathaniel with deep concern, but the old healer waved off her worry with a tired, satisfied smile. "I'll manage," he said. "Go, finish this. You've carried this burden long enough. I have herbs enough to tend my own wound, and I've survived worse in my years, believe me." "I won't leave you here alone and injured," Elena insisted, though Nathaniel simply chuckled and shook his head. "I've lived alone in these woods for years, girl. I think I can manage a scratch and 2 bound prisoners until proper help arrives." He nodded toward one of Damon's warriors. "Leave one of your men here to help me secure these 2, and tend to anything else that needs doing. The rest of you go. This matter needs finishing at Blackthorn Lands, not out here." Damon agreed, leaving one warrior behind with clear instructions, before turning back to Elena. "Ride with me," he said. "It will be faster than any other way back." Elena nodded, and together with Damon, she mounted his horse, ready to return to the place that had cast her out, not as an exiled traitor this time, but as a woman, finally on the verge of reclaiming the truth that had been stolen from her. News of Corin's attempted attack on Elena and the failed effort to silence Nathaniel spread quickly among the small group of warriors who had ridden with Damon, and though he had asked for discretion, word inevitably began to travel faster than their horses could carry them back to Packlands. By the time they arrived, a tense, uncertain energy had already begun rippling through the stronghold, whispers passing from warrior to warrior, servant to servant, though few understood yet the full shape of what had happened. Corin, aware that something had gone wrong when his men failed to return with confirmation of success, had already begun preparing to leave, gathering what supplies he could without drawing attention, calculating how much time remained before suspicion turned fully in his direction. He had spent the better part of the morning telling himself that Christopher and Nathan had simply encountered delays, that there was no reason yet for alarm, even as a cold, familiar dread settled deeper into his chest with every passing hour of silence. He did not get the chance to finish his preparations. Damon rode directly into the central courtyard, Elena beside him, and the sight of her, alive, unharmed, and clearly under the king's protection rather than his condemnation, sent a wave of stunned silence rippling through everyone who witnessed their arrival. Warriors froze mid-task. Servants stopped in doorways. Even the elders, gathering hastily at the commotion, stared in open disbelief. Oliver, the young warrior who had once trained alongside Elena, was among the first to reach the courtyard, his expression shifting rapidly, from shock to something like shame, as he took in the sight of her returning, not as a fugitive dragged back for further punishment, but seated proudly beside the king himself. "Summon the full council," Damon commanded, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. Immediately. And bring Corin before me. Now. Corin emerged from the barracks moments later, his expression carefully composed, despite the panic Elena could see flickering behind his eyes. He bowed briefly toward Damon, his voice smooth and practiced, though a faint tremor beneath the surface betrayed him to anyone watching closely enough. My king, I heard rumors of trouble on the eastern paths. Is everything? Do not, Damon said, cutting him off with a voice like ice. Insult me further with pretense. I know what you did, Corin. I have known for days now. Your men failed. They confessed everything before we returned. The color drained from Corin's face, though he attempted, briefly, to maintain his composure. My king, I do not understand what you... Enough. Damon's voice thundered across the courtyard, silencing whatever excuse Corin had been preparing. You orchestrated the ambush that killed 12 of our warriors. You fed information to the Ashford clan. You threatened Elena into silence, and when she tried to warn me, you bribed a guard to ensure that warning never reached me. When the ambush succeeded exactly as you planned, you planted a forged note in her handwriting to ensure the blame fell entirely upon her, an innocent woman who trusted this pack with everything she had. Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd as the elders arrived, Grace among them, her face pale as the pieces Damon laid out began aligning with the small, nagging doubts she had carried silently for weeks. Henry, the elder who had once quietly urged more caution before Elena's judgment, stood near the back of the growing crowd, his expression a complicated mixture of vindication and grief that he had not pressed his own doubts harder in that fateful hearing. And when you feared the truth might finally surface, Damon continued, his voice unwavering, despite the fury barely contained beneath it, you sent men to murder her in the woods, where she had taken shelter, to erase her, before she could ever clear her name. Your men are bound and awaiting judgment even now, along with the healer who nearly gave his life protecting her from your cruelty. Corin's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. His eyes darted toward the gathered crowd, searching desperately for any avenue of escape, any argument that might yet save him. Finding none, something cold and resentful settled over his expression instead, the mask finally dropping away entirely. She took what should have been mine, he spat, his voice trembling with years of suppressed bitterness. I served this pack faithfully for a decade, and you gave the position I deserved to some untested warrior, because she whispered a recommendation in your ear. I was owed more than I received, and no one was willing to give it to me honestly, so I took what I needed, the only way left available to me. You murdered 12 of our own people, Damon said, his voice shaking now, with barely restrained rage, to satisfy your own wounded pride. They were casualties, Corin said coldly, necessary to achieve what I deserved. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Warriors who had lost friends and family in the ambush, surging forward with fury, held back only by Damon's raised hand, and the discipline of pack law demanding a proper judgment, rather than immediate violence. A woman near the front of the crowd, whom Elena recognized as the widow of one of the fallen warriors, sobbed openly at Corin's cold admission, her grief finally finding the true target it had been denied for so many weeks. Elena stepped forward then, her voice steady, despite everything she had endured, addressing not Corin, but the gathered pack, the people who had once so quickly condemned her. I understand why you believed the evidence against me, she said, her eyes moving across the crowd, finding faces both familiar and unfamiliar, all watching her now, with expressions that had shifted from suspicion to something closer to shame. Grief makes people desperate for someone to blame, and the evidence was crafted carefully enough to convince even those who should have known me better. I do not hold that against you entirely, but I hope, going forward, that this pack remembers what happened here today, remembers how easily truth can be buried beneath convenient lies, and remembers to seek proof more carefully before condemning someone so completely. Grace, visibly moved, stepped forward and bowed her head toward Elena, an unprecedented gesture from an elder toward someone recently exiled. You have my deepest apologies, she said, and you will have my full support in restoring your name and your place within this pack. Damon turned to the assembled warriors, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority once more. Corin will stand trial before the full council for the murder of 12 of our own, for the attempted murder of Elena, and the healer Nathaniel who sheltered her, and for the deliberate deception of this entire pack. Justice will be carried out according to our laws, fully and without mercy for the crimes he has confessed to committing. Corin was led away under heavy guard, his protests fading into the cold afternoon air, the weight of his own choices finally catching up to him, after years of careful, resentful planning. His final words, hurled bitterly over his shoulder as the warriors dragged him from the courtyard, were not of remorse, but of continued resentment. A man unable, even in his final moments of exposure, to understand that his own choices, not the injustices he imagined against him, had brought him to this ruin. Damon turned then to Elena, and in front of the entire gathered pack, he knelt before her, an act of humility that stunned everyone watching, an alpha king, lowering himself before the very woman he had once condemned. "I failed you," he said, his voice raw with genuine remorse. "I let my grief blind me to the truth, and in doing so, I nearly destroyed the one person who has always been true to this pack, and true to me. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for it anyway, because I cannot imagine continuing forward without you beside me." Elena looked down at him, tears filling her eyes once more, though these tears carried a very different weight than the ones she had shed in the frozen woods weeks earlier. "You hurt me deeply," she said honestly, "because pretending otherwise would have been a lie neither of them deserved. But I also understand grief, and I understand how easily it can distort even good judgment. What matters now is what you do going forward, not simply what happened in a moment of terrible pain. Then let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that I have learned from this mistake," Damon said, rising to his feet, taking her hands gently in his own. "Let me earn back the trust I so carelessly threw away." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the sincerity she needed to see, and found it there, plain and unguarded, none of the cold distance that had haunted her since the council hall. "Then we begin again," she said softly. Not as though nothing happened, but as something stronger, built with eyes open this time. In the weeks that followed Corin's trial and the pack's full acceptance of the truth, the Blackthorn stronghold began to heal, in ways that went far deeper than simply restoring Elena's rank and title. The council formally cleared her name before the entire pack, and Grace personally oversaw the recording of the true events into pack history, ensuring that no future generation would ever mistake the lies that had nearly destroyed an innocent life for truth. The trial itself was brief, given the completeness of Corin's own confession in the courtyard, though the council insisted on hearing full testimony from Edward, Margaret, Lily, and the two captured warriors, Christopher and Nathan, each of whom offered their account with varying degrees of shame and remorse. Christopher, in particular, seemed genuinely horrified by the scope of what he had participated in, having believed, he claimed, that Corin's task involved simple intimidation rather than murder. The council weighed his testimony carefully, ultimately sentencing him to years of restricted service rather than the harsher punishment reserved for Corin himself, whose calculated cruelty left no room for such leniency. Nathaniel, recovering well from his injuries under the care of Blackthorn healers who had traveled to bring him back safely to the Packlands, was honored publicly for his courage in sheltering Elena and standing against Corin's men despite the danger to himself. He accepted a permanent place of respect within the pack, though he insisted, with characteristic dry humor, that he preferred his quiet cabin to constant company, and would return to it once his strength fully returned. "You're welcome here any time," Damon told him personally, during a quiet visit to the healer's chambers, where Nathaniel was recovering. "You saved the life of someone precious to me, and to this pack. That debt is not one I take lightly." "I didn't do it for reward," Nathaniel said, waving off the sentiment with characteristic bluntness. "I did it because it was right. But I won't pretend I mind the good wine your kitchens have been sending over these past few days." Edward, the young guard whose bribed silence had contributed to the tragedy, faced his own reckoning before the council. Though his actions had caused genuine harm, the council recognized that he had been deceived rather than willingly complicit in murder, and his punishment, while serious, allowed him the chance to serve out his redemption through years of dedicated service rather than permanent exile. He approached Elena privately, weeks after his sentencing, offering an apology so genuine and so burdened with guilt that Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, offering him forgiveness in return. "Holding on to anger toward everyone who failed me would leave no room for anything else," she told him simply. I would rather use what happened to make this pact stronger, not to carry bitterness forward. Edward's eyes filled with tears at her words, and he bowed deeply before her, a gesture of respect that felt far more genuine than any formal apology could have conveyed. I will spend the rest of my service earning that forgiveness, he said. I swear it. Damon, true to his word, spent those weeks working tirelessly to rebuild the trust his hasty judgment had shattered. He sought Elena's counsel openly in matters of pact governance, made a point of listening fully before reaching conclusions in council meetings, and worked to establish clearer protocols, ensuring that no future accusation could ever again be handled with such reckless speed. Evidence would be examined thoroughly. Accused pact members would be given genuine opportunity to defend themselves before judgment was passed. The mistake that had nearly cost Elena her life would not be repeated against anyone else within Blackthorn lands. He also made a point, in the weeks that followed, of formally recognizing Grace's careful observation, Margaret's honest confession, and Lily's quiet courage in coming forward, elevating each of them within the pact's structure, in ways that acknowledged the vital role their honesty had played in uncovering the truth. Lily, whose quiet persistence in questioning the events surrounding the ambush had contributed meaningfully to uncovering the truth, found herself elevated to a position of trust within the pact's administration, her sharp instincts recognized and valued in ways they had never been before. I never expected anything for simply asking questions, Lily told Elena during a quiet conversation in the gardens one afternoon. I only wanted to know the truth. That's precisely why it mattered so much, Elena replied warmly. Most people stop asking questions when the answer everyone else has already accepted feels comfortable enough. You didn't stop. That took real courage, even if it didn't always feel that way to you. The younger warrior whose appointment had originally sparked Corin's resentment continued to serve faithfully, unaware for a long while of just how close his position had come to costing an innocent woman her life, though when he eventually learned the full story, he sought out Elena to thank her personally for the recommendation that had changed his path, and to express his sorrow for the pain that decision had indirectly caused her. I never meant for anyone to suffer because of my appointment, he said, clearly troubled by the weight of the revelation. You didn't cause any of this, Elena reassured him gently. Corin's choices were his own. Do not carry guilt that was never yours to bear. Simply continue serving this pack well. That is thanks enough. Slowly, carefully, the pack began to knit itself back together, stronger in many ways for having survived the crisis, more thoughtful in its judgments, more willing to question convenient narratives, rather than accepting them at face value, simply because grief demanded quick answers. The Harvest Festival, delayed by weeks due to the trial and its aftermath, finally took place beneath clear spring skies, and Elena found herself, for the first time in months, surrounded by warmth and celebration rather than suspicion and fear. Charlotte, the young girl who had once been pulled away from Elena in the council hall, approached her shyly during the festival, offering a small braided flower crown as a gift, her earlier fear replaced now with open affection. My mother said I could talk to you again, Charlotte said earnestly. I'm sorry I didn't believe you before. Elena knelt down to accept the gift, smiling warmly, despite the lingering ache the memory still carried. You were young, and frightened, and did what your mother told you. There's nothing to forgive. I'm just glad we get to be friends again now. On a clear evening several months after Elena's return, Damon found her standing on the same balcony where they had once shared quiet mornings together, before everything had fallen apart. The winter had fully passed now, replaced by the gentle warmth of early spring, new growth pushing up through soil that had so recently been frozen and lifeless. I've been thinking, Damon said, joining her at the railing, about everything your journal taught me. Not just the truth about Corin, but the truth about you, about fears you never felt safe enough to share with me directly. Elena turned to look at him, curious. What do you mean? You wrote about being afraid of disappointing me, he said quietly. Afraid you would never be enough as my mate. I want you to know that fear was never true, not for a single moment, and I am sorry I never made that clear enough, for you to feel safe sharing those doubts with me while you were still writing them into a journal, instead of speaking them aloud. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion, touched that he had absorbed not just the facts of her innocence, but the deeper vulnerability she had poured into those private pages. I think, she said slowly, that we both have things to learn about trusting each other completely, not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, ordinary days between them. Then let's learn together, Damon said, reaching for her hand. Starting now, and continuing for as long as we both shall live. I promise you, Elena, I will never again let fear or grief speak louder than my faith in you. And I promise, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the emotion thick in her chest, that I will not carry my doubts silently, in pages meant only for myself. If something troubles me, you will hear it from my own voice, not discover it hidden beneath a floorboard, weeks after it was too late to matter. Damon smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she had seen from him since her return, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. That sounds like a fair trade, he said. Elena smiled too, the first truly unguarded smile she had allowed herself in a very long time, and laced her fingers through his. Behind them, the packlands stretched out toward the horizon, warriors training in the courtyard below, children playing near the stables, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing forward with a resilience that mirrored Elena's own journey from exile back to belonging. The scars of what had happened would remain, quiet reminders carried by everyone who had lived through those difficult weeks. But scars, Elena had come to understand, were not signs of weakness. They were proof of survival, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal into something strong enough to bear whatever came next. As the sun set gently over Blackthorn lands, casting warm gold light across the stronghold that had once cast her out and had now welcomed her back with open arms, Elena allowed herself, finally, to simply breathe, to simply exist, in a moment of peace she had feared she might never experience again. The truth had taken time to surface. It had cost pain, fear, and nearly her life to bring it into the light. But it had surfaced nonetheless, patient and unwavering, exactly as it always had been, waiting only for someone willing enough to look closely enough to find it. And in finding it, both Elena and Damon had discovered something perhaps even more valuable than vindication alone, a partnership rebuilt not on blind assumption, but on hard-won understanding, ready now to face whatever future still lay ahead of them, together and unafraid.